He was pushing a mop down a hallway that smelled of disinfectant and broken dreams. It was 11:47 at night. The office was empty, except for him. And as he passed the glass-walled boardroom at the end of the corridor, he stopped. He stared through the glass at the long mahogany table, the leather chairs, the skyline glittering beyond the windows. And someone who noticed him standing there, one of the last executives leaving for the night, actually laughed. Not at a joke. At him still here. "Daniel," the man said, buttoning his coat. Daniel didn't answer. He just picked up his mop and kept walking. That night, he drove home in a car with a cracked windshield and a heater that didn't work. And he asked himself a question he'd been afraid to ask for years. What if this isn't the end of my story? This is Unstoppable Stories. And today, you're going to discover how a man who cleaned other people's offices ended up owning one. Daniel Carter grew up in a part of the city that most people only drove through on the highway fast, with their doors locked. His mother cleaned houses. His father worked 2 jobs, factory by day, security guard by night, and still came home with empty pockets and tired eyes. There was never enough. Not enough food, not enough space, not enough time. But there was always enough love. His mother used to say, "Daniel, your circumstances are not your character." He didn't fully understand that when he was 9. It started too when he was 12, the year his father got laid off. The lights in their apartment went out for 11 days straight. He did his homework by candlelight. He never missed a single day of school, because even then, something inside Daniel refused to accept that the life he was living was the only life available to him. He graduated high school, just barely. Having worked part-time since he was 15, college was never discussed. There was no money, no blueprint, no one in his world who had gone before him to show him the path. So he did what you do when you have no map. He took the next available road. He applied for a night cleaning job at a downtown office building. It was 22 years old. He told himself it was temporary. 7 years later, he was still there. 7 years. 2,555 mornings of going home as the rest of the city was just waking up. Daniel had tried to leave. Twice, he'd enrolled in community college night classes, and twice, the hours of the job ate into the hours of study until he had nothing left to give. Once, he'd saved enough to start a small cleaning business with a friend. They had 2 contracts lined up. Then the friend disappeared with every dollar they'd saved. The contracts fell through. Daniel was back at the building, pushing the same mop, emptying the same waste baskets. The worst part wasn't the physical exhaustion. It was the invisibility. He watched people walk past him every day without making eye contact. He learned things about their lives from what they threw away: business plans, resignation letters, expensive takeout containers, while they knew nothing about him. He was furniture to them. And then came the night that changed everything for the worse, before it got better. A new building manager arrived, young, brash, determined to impress. He called a staff meeting for the cleaning crew, read their names off a clipboard like they were items on an inventory sheet. Then he looked up at Daniel. "You, Carter. Right, you've been here 7 years." "Yes, sir." The manager shook his head slowly, almost pitying. 7 years, and you're still on level 1. That tells me something. A few people in the room looked away. Some stared at the floor. Daniel felt something cold move through his chest. Would that be the moment that finally broke him? Or the moment that finally woke him up? Daniel drove home that night in silence. No radio. No podcast. No distraction. Just the sound of the engine and the hum of the highway and his own breathing. He sat in the parking lot of his apartment for 45 minutes before going inside. And something happened in those 45 minutes that he would later describe as the most important conversation of his life. He had it with himself. "I am 30 years old," he said out loud, in the dark, to no one. "I've spent 7 years being invisible, and I am going to spend the rest of my life invisible, unless I decide, right now, that I am not. Not a wish, not a prayer, but a decision." He didn't have money. He didn't have connections. He didn't have a degree. What he had was this: 7 years of watching businesses operate from the inside. He had watched companies make decisions, He had read discarded memos. He had seen which departments stayed late and which ones left early. He had noticed which businesses were growing and which ones were quietly struggling. And that night, Daniel Carter decided to take everything he knew and bet it on himself. He gave himself 1 year. He bought a used laptop from a pawn shop for $60, and he started learning. He worked the night shift from 10 to 6. He slept from 7 to noon. He studied from 1 in the afternoon until 9 at night. Every single day. He started with free online courses, business basics, marketing fundamentals, financial literacy. He learned how to read a balance sheet, how to write a business proposal, how to calculate a profit margin. Things that had felt foreign became familiar. Things that once seemed designed for other people started making sense. He filled 3 notebooks in the first month. He filled 12 more by the end of the year. And this is exactly why stories like these are shared here on Unstoppable Stories. Because the gap between who someone is and who they're capable of becoming is almost never about talent. It's almost always about decision and daily discipline and the willingness to start small when you have to. Daniel started small. His idea was simple. A commercial cleaning company, but one built differently. Not just cleaning, full facility management. Cleaning, maintenance, minor repairs, all in one contract. He'd seen the need from the inside. He drafted a proposal, rewrote it 14 times. Then he printed it at a library, took the bus to 3 small businesses he'd researched, and walked in cold. All 3 said no. He came back the following week with a revised version. 2 more said no. Then, on a rainy Tuesday morning, a small dental office on the 3rd floor of a building he'd cleaned for years said yes. 1 client, $500 a month. He worked that contract himself, evenings and weekends, around his night shift. For 8 months, he barely slept. But he was building something. At month 9, he hired his first employee, his younger cousin, who needed work and whom Daniel could trust. At month 14, he quit the night shift. That morning, he sat in the parking lot of the building he'd cleaned for 7 years and looked at it for a long time. He wasn't sad. He wasn't angry. He was grateful, because that building had taught him everything. By the end of year 2, Daniel had 11 clients and 4 employees. He moved his operation from his kitchen table to a small rented office for walls and a window. Nothing more, but it was his. He was different now, too. Not just professionally, in ways that were harder to explain and more important to understand. He walked differently, spoke differently. He no longer apologized for taking up space in a room. He had learned to look people in the eye and say exactly what his business offered and exactly what it was worth. Not because he had become someone else, because he had finally become fully himself. His mother came to see the office on the day he got the key. She stood in the doorway and looked at the empty room, bare walls, a second-hand desk, a window with a view of a parking structure, and her eyes filled with tears. "Your circumstances are not your character," she said. He knew what it meant now. 5 years after that 45-minute conversation in a parking lot, Daniel Carter was sitting at the head of a boardroom table. Not behind glass. At the table, his company, Cardo Facility Solutions, had grown to 38 employees and was managing facilities for over 60 commercial clients across the city. Annual revenue just under $3 million. He had won a Small Business Excellence Award from the City Chamber of Commerce. He had been invited to speak at a local university. The same kind of institution that once felt like it existed in another dimension from him. And on the day he received the formal title of CEO of his own company, he thought about the executive who had laughed at him in the hallway. He didn't feel anger. He felt something closer to compassion, because he understood now that the man hadn't really been laughing at Daniel. He'd been looking at a mop and a uniform and seeing a story that was already finished. He hadn't known that the story was just beginning. Daniel had learned something that executive didn't. You cannot judge where someone is going by where they are standing. Now, here's something important to say. Daniel's journey took nearly 6 years from that parking lot to that boardroom. 6 years of early mornings and exhausted nights and months where the income barely covered expenses. There were setbacks not included in this story because there were simply too many to name. Contracts lost. Employees who left. Monty's couldn't pay himself. Not everyone who works this hard gets this exact result. That is The truth. Some people face barriers far heavier than what Daniel faced. Some start with even less. Some try just as hard, and the outcome looks different. This story isn't told to promise you his results. It's told to show you what becomes possible when a person refuses, despite everything, to accept a permanent ceiling. The night shift doesn't have to be where your story ends. The rejection doesn't have to be the verdict. The job that makes you invisible doesn't have to be the last word on who you are. Sometimes the place that diminishes you is quietly teaching you, giving you knowledge, perspective, and fire that cannot be purchased or borrowed from anyone else. Daniel Carter didn't become a CEO despite being a janitor. He became one, in part, because of it. And if you are sitting somewhere right now, in a job that doesn't see you, in a season that feels like it might never change, in a version of yourself that hasn't quite arrived yet, hear this. The struggle is not evidence that you were made for less. It may be the very thing preparing you for more. This is Unstoppable Stories. Because every great success story begins the moment someone refuses to let their current chapter be. Their final one. What part of Daniel's story hit you the hardest? Have you ever been in a room where someone underestimated you? And what did you do with that moment? Drop your answer in the comments below. Your story might be the one that inspires someone else. And if this moved you, subscribe to Unstoppable Stories for more powerful journeys of resilience, courage, and the quiet, stubborn refusal to give up.